Returning to our series regarding philosophies that are categorized under secularism, we are going to take a little bit of time really beginning to consider philosophies more contemporary in our day. In other words, philosophies of which you may or may not be somewhat familiar. Today we're going to start with one that is typically very unfamiliar to the lay person, and we'll get to that here in a second. But I want to return to something that we introduced in the very beginning of this series, and that is the lesson coming from Paul, or the warning coming from Paul as it relates to philosophy. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9, he said, "Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in him, who is the head of all principality and power." I just want to briefly say here that Paul doesn't warn us against philosophy in general. He's not saying don't engage at all with any philosophy. He's talking about specifically the vain philosophies that will deceive you. And this is the reason we are taking something of a bird's eye view of some of these secular philosophies so that we can be on guard and we can have the counter perspective. Part of educating, part of this pedagogical role of teaching includes unteaching. We've all been infused with secularism. We've all grown in a world full of secularism, and we have not been immune from its influences. And so this is why we are going through these series, so that we can be on guard and beware of these specific philosophies that are not of Christ and that will deceive you. And these are futile philosophies. And I hope that we've seen that somewhat, even in the philosophies or worldviews of which we have considered, but we will see that definitely moving forward. It is more of a purposive means of ridding us of the gospel, ridding us of Christ. So these are not unchristian, these are anti-Christ. Now, I want to begin again with a philosophy that is fairly unknown, okay? And this is likely going to be, the only entire session I ever devote to the philosophy of positivism, okay? Now, what we typically think of when we hear of positivism is the whole means through which you just want to magnify and embrace the positive and try to reduce the negative and look out for Mr. In-Between, that kind of thing. You just want positive thoughts, positive feelings, and so on. That's not what we're talking about here, okay? This is a philosophical system that positivism itself has basically died away, but we will see that it has evolved really into other systems, and which I want to show you over the course of this session. So again, we are trying to beware. The whole reason we're doing this series is so that we can learn about some of these philosophies to beware. So today we are going to consider positivism, really leading into pluralism in our next session, God willing. Okay. Now, the main architect or founder, or the one who introduced positivism, is another fairly unknown named Auguste Comte. Okay, and that's the only time I'm going to call him Comte. Okay, that's the French pronunciation. I don't know if you've noticed, I'm not French. I'm Texan. Okay, so I speak like a Texan. So Auguste Comte was obviously born in 1798, and he died in 1857. Incidentally, I found out that he was 5'3". I don't know why somebody decided that was important information, but I was like, well, that's very interesting. So again, he wanted to establish this framework and this worldview of positivism. Now, before we even consider positivism, I want to take a step back to really review some things first, okay? And look, again, I don't really love doing this, but I think the visual helps capture the lesson that I'm attempting to teach anyway. So down here, what we're going to do is kind of have this line, and look, we are going to return to this. Okay, that's why I'm introducing it now. we are going to have something of a barrier here, okay? This down here is the world in which we live. This is the world of time and space. Above this time and space, and in a sense, beyond it as well, is the eternal and transcendence, okay? So again, we live here. Now, philosophy, the ancient philosophers were continually looking for unity in diversity. There's so much diversity in the world. We look outside, we see trees, we see dogs, we see other people, we see cars, we see all sorts of different divergent species. You know, we have vegetation, we have minerals, you have all sorts of different things and classifications that are so diverse. And so the one question was, what is the one thing that unifies all this together? From which we get the word universe. That is unity in diversity. Okay? And so what we call these little data bits, okay, the particular things that we see or hear, that we sense with our sense perception, that we can know and study through our senses, is called, the plural anyway, is called the phenomena. Now, Comte really came just after the Kantian Revolution, which is, again, something, God willing, we will take some time to consider. So, again, we will be returning to this. This is the phenomenal realm to Kant as well, and this is the noumenal realm, but again, we'll wait until we discuss Kant. But the data bits are called what we call phenomena. Okay, the plural is phenomena, the singular is phenomenon. Now, again, in philosophy, what we were looking for, what men were looking for, what people were looking for, is what is the unity? What is the one unity? What is the thing? Or who is the person who brings all things together? In the Christian paradigm, what do we think is the unity? God, right? Good job, Judah. Okay, so in the Christian perspective, we have God. So in the theological science, we see God as the great unifier from which all things are and continue to be. He sustains all things. He created all things. He remains sovereign over these things. So he is the unifier of all of that diversity. Now, in philosophy, they really saw unity as an abstract principle. It could be reason, it could be the mind. And so what do we call this study, the science of abstract reason? We have physics down here. What do we have up here? Metaphysics. Okay, so that's what we consider in philosophy. So again, in theology, we say the one person who unifies all the diversity is God. The philosophers basically see it as mind or reason. That's an oversimplification, okay? And we can consider the history of philosophy another time, God willing. Again, incidentally, most people don't know about Auguste Comte and or positivism, but anybody who is a student of philosophy and or the history of philosophy definitely studies Auguste Comte. And so, again, the theological perspective is that God is the unifier. In philosophy, it is metaphysics. Basically, through the study of metaphysics, we come to the union in all of the diversity, okay? Now, so what Comte really wanted to do is remove us from that eternal and transcendent world. He saw himself as a reformer, and so he wanted to reform society. He said, he noticed that there were stages in every person's life. You know, you go from infant to adolescence to adulthood and so on, and he saw this in society as well. And so he has these three stages through which he hoped for society to emerge and mature on the other side of these first two stages. Okay, so the first stage of society is essentially the infantile stage. This is where we're filled with superstition, where we're trying to find the answers unscientifically. You know, we get scared of the thunder, we get scared of storms, and so we seek a theological answer to all of our problems, okay? Then we mature into adolescence, which is the metaphysical stage of life. So for Comte, society began theologically, and then it matured into philosophy. Anybody who has studied history of man knows this already isn't entirely, is at least not the entirety of the picture. But I digress. Okay, until finally society reaches maturity, which is the scientific stage of life. Again, the maturation of society is necessary. We must be rid and leave off the theological realm and or the metaphysical realm and find life where we are and when we are. So for Comte, let me just back up here for a second. He has two main works for which he's kind of well known anyway. His course on positive philosophy, which is 5 volumes, so I'm not about to stand up here and recommend that to anybody. But just so that anybody can get the counter perspective, if you have atheists lecturing on Christianity, they are not going to give you an apologetic book. They're not going to give you a book from C.S. Lewis or anybody like that. I am more than happy to. His other book is a general view of positivism. It's not all that long, as you can see. And, you know, you can read this and consider this yourself. And this is something I think I strongly recommend for the Christian. However, so his epistemology is more found in the courses of positive philosophy. This gives you basically general view of positivism, and it's so optimistic because positivism was being embraced, in particular France, and there's much to that. So I just leave you to his book. I have to condense all this. Obviously, I have to be somewhat selective about what we consider, even considering Comte, but we must move on. Okay, so again, these are the 3 stages that Comte is looking for. And this is why, technically, again, spawning out of the Kantian revolution, man cannot know anything beyond the phenomena. So essentially, this is unknowable. We just can't know this, okay? Whether it exists or not is another question entirely, but it's kind of irrelevant because even if it does exist, we can't know it. We live in this world, and so with the phenomena, which we can only see and taste and touch and know from our senses and so on. So all of reality, all of our lives must be here because we can't even know this. Now, again, to return to this word, universe, broken down etymologically, is unity and diversity. In our nation, we have the motto, e pluribus unum, out of the many, one. Again, a unity in the diversity. Comte, rejecting this, is basically exclaiming and recommending e pluribus plurum, out of the many, many. This is utter and only diversity, no unity. It's just a confluence of a bunch of little data bits with really no unity and no reason to look for unity because we can't know it. Okay? So, Comte said that there are no universals save one. And there are no absolutes save one. He said everything, this is the absolute statement, the only one universal. Remember, we can't know this, but this is the only thing we can conveniently know. But this is the thing we know. Everything is relative. So he's saying there are no absolutes save for this absolute. That absolutely there are no absolutes. It's a self-defeating proposition, and this is immediately noticed. But again, he gave himself the out by saying, except for this one. This is the only absolute. This is the only universal. Not God, not metaphysics, but somehow metaphysically he came to one universal absolute. conveniently enough. So, now what grew out of Comte, because Comte was way too optimistic and unrealistic, Thomas Huxley, who was actually around this time, he said what Comte has given us is basically Catholicism without Christianity. And that's kind of what Comte was looking for. He wanted to eschew all the religions and so on, but they actually established a temple for positivism and so on. And again, I don't really want to get into that, but ultimately Thomas Huxley, his critique, and he was a positivist, okay, but his criticism of Comte was that he's basically given us Catholicism without Christianity. So again, I'm sure very few know about logical positivism. Now I want to just share with you that, so we begin with positivism, okay, which moves to logical positivism, which is different than positivism. It's an outgrowing of positivism, but it's a more sophisticated worldview and philosophy, which we'll get to here in a second. Finally, this analytical philosophy definitely isn't the same as logical positivism, but again, analytical philosophy is definitely an outgrowing of logical positivism. And all I want to say at this point is I believe that the two main philosophies of the 20th century, the ones that influence the world and our culture in particular the most, is existentialism, which we've taken a little bit of time to consider, and analytical philosophy. And we'll conclude somewhat with discussing analytical philosophy, but again, this analytical philosophy, if you go to college now, if you go to a secular university right now, this is what you'll be taught. Introduced by Bertrand Russell and the like, and so on. So logical positivism was introduced by men like, not really introduced, but embraced by people such as A.J. Ayer, Anthony Flew, the one who later converted into deism. Many Christians think he became a Christian. Sadly, he did not. But he definitely rejected all this. So what they called themselves in the 20s, logical positivism really spawned in the 30s and the 40s, but it began with a club, with a group of men entitling themselves, obviously in Vienna, calling themselves the Vienna Circle. Now I do just have to very briefly say here, I think we should kind of be in awe, and not a reverent awe, but I do find it somewhat fascinating how through the history of philosophy, so many times a handful of men changed the entire world. We considered pragmatism in our last session, considering William James and John Dewey and so on, the metaphysical club, right? Just those handful of men changed the world. Go back to Athens. You start with Socrates, and his disciple was Plato. His disciple was Aristotle, whose basic main disciple was Alexander the Great. Pretty world-changing. Okay, so again, in the 1920s, this began to emerge, logical positivism. So, what the logical positivists were really looking to do is to define meaning, okay? So, what they said was that the term, the name, the word God is meaningless. Now, as I understand, Christians will lament this and say, well, that's crazy. People have spilled their own, people have died for the name, for the word, for the person of God. So when you think of the word God being meaningful, maybe the problem lies in the fact that we define meaning differently, okay? And that's what I'm suggesting here, obviously. So what they came up with, okay, in order to define meaning, ultimately the only meaning, there is no assertion or statement is meaningful unless it is either analytical or synthetic. Simple, right? You understand that, right? I'll simplify this here in just a second, but again, I just want us to understand at the outset, before we even dive into this, that what they're trying to do is define meaning. So when they say meaningless, again, that is from their perspective. Okay, now to verify something, again, this is a verification principle. We all know what it means to verify something, right? Basically to show that it's true. How would we verify that a husband is a married man? Or how do we verify that a triangle has 3 sides? How do you verify that?
Your eyes.
Well, no. Do you have to see a triangle to know that it has 3 sides? Do you have to see a husband to know that he's a married man? It's built into the definition. The word itself. So analytical, basically, it's in the definition. Okay, a husband is a married man is a husband, so you could just reverse the two and be saying the same exact thing. Synthetic is a little bit different. Let's talk about the husband. Okay, a husband is a married man, but if you talk about a big husband, well, the term bigness isn't really fixed into the definition of husband, so that's more synthetic. How do you verify how big that husband is? First of all, you got to define what big is, but let's say you actually define that. How do you prove, or how do you verify that that husband, that particular husband, the truth of the statement, that husband is big? You've got to go out and see this husband, right? Bob, the husband, is big. We got to go see Bob. We got to know how big Bob is, if he does, come under our rubric of bigness and so on. And so again, you have to verify this synthetically, basically with the senses. It's the only way you can verify synthetically. Okay, so analytically is one thing. That's obvious enough, but synthetically is only done by way of our senses. Okay, so again, basically, what this can boil down to, just to make it a little easier, is that no assertion or statement is meaningful unless it can be empirically verified, unless it can be scientifically verified. Now, what's wrong with that? Let's say, I hear our preacher preaching in the pulpit, and I get up and say, that's cute, it's really adorable, but that is utterly meaningless. The only meaningful statement is that which can be scientifically proven, and nothing, or very little that you're saying in your pulpit, it can be verified empirically. We can't put God in a laboratory, right? Have you ever heard God speak? Have you ever touched God? Have you ever, smelled God? No. And so we can't prove him empirically. What's wrong with this statement? It's so, sadly, afterward you'll feel it, kind of silly. But again, let's say that man stands up, or let me just cut the Gordian knot, and essentially this statement falls on its own weight. We can't prove this statement empirically. To say that there are no assertions, no statement is meaningful unless it can be empirically verified, we can't take that statement into a laboratory. We can't synthetically verify that principle. It's a self-defeating principle. And if it's a self-defeating principle, it is not true, certainly at least not meaningful. So they failed in defining meaning. But again, that's what they're really saying as relates to God. The term God, the word God, the name God is meaningless because we can't verify it synthetically. And sadly, again, it wasn't long before people understood this, which moved into the analytical philosophy. So it wasn't long before people understood this. But positivism and logical positivism has had its influence. We still live under the results and the conclusions and what came out of the history of these ideas. Now, lastly, with the time that we have, I want to consider Ludwig Wittgenstein. Okay, so now again, he was born later. This is a later gentleman going into the 20th century. Now, I don't have any slides after this. Okay, so what he decided in the terms of words, because the logical positivism really devolved into a movement really in the 60s and the 70s called the theothanatology. Yeah, the death of God movement. Because again, there was a crisis in language. If the word God is utterly meaningless, then what other word has any meaning? And so we might as well drug ourselves and stupefy ourselves in this life and just exist. And so that's what happened. And again, the ramifications of that continue on. But he decided that the meaning of words, just again, to put this simply, is the meaning of it is determined by its common usage, by how people use it. No longer its etymological derivation or even its historical meaning, okay? But only how it's being commonly used. And again, this is something that has been very influential in our day. So again, I wanted to merely introduce this fairly briefly before we consider pluralism and or relativism, which definitely, in my opinion, is probably the greatest deceit, again, vain philosophy in which we live, especially in particular in America. We talked about pragmatism, but there is no truth. There are no absolutes. Hello, Comte. And that's what people say now. You have your truth, I have my truth. And again, so we define the term God differently. And that's why I tried to make the point last week that there is an extent to which this is true. When we use the word God, we do mean one thing. But they reduce it as, therefore, because the term God is meaningless, then when you talk about God and you find it meaningful, that's just saying something emotive about yourself. In other words, in my vocation as a teaching minister and so on, what I'm teaching you, according to these people, is no objective truth at all. I'm not actually informing you at all. I'm not teaching you at all. All I'm telling you is how I feel about certain things, because the term God is utterly meaningless. So when we meet people, when they are and where they are, we have to know this. Again, we are the missionaries to our neighbors, to the people which we come in contact each and every day. And they all have been influenced by these philosophies. And they all will think of God one way. We have to be able to find them where they are and speak to them where they are and where they are. It doesn't do us any good to get frustrated and balk the whole system because they fail to see God is now on the other side of the veil, on the other side of the Jordan, on the other side of your salvation. The word God means something. Actually has an eternal definition, an ultimate definition. He's not fixed, he's not temporal, he's eternal and he's divine. But when you speak to someone who is not of this persuasion, who does not yet have eyes to see or ears to hear, it doesn't do us any good to shout at them. It's like shouting to a deaf person. Have you ever seen that? Or a Rush Hour, remember? He was yelling because they didn't have the same language. So, I want to conclude with Ecclesiastes. Again, I love to read Spurgeon's sermons every Saturday with my dear wife, Sarah. I have 10 volumes of Spurgeon's sermons. Definitely encourage anybody to read through Spurgeon's sermons. Yesterday, by God's grace, we read one on Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2, which reads, "Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting." I briefly want to say here that positivism, humanism, pragmatism, all the philosophies we've discussed, are ultimately looking for the man's happiness, not temporal joy, not this fleeting thing in which comfort somewhat through technology, through the sciences and so on, to have a life where we don't have to worry about as much. We don't have to go hunt and gather. We don't have to worry about being a tribe and a village and superstitiously believing in this God and so on. We have matured, but they're looking for happiness for mankind. Again, that's a simplified way of looking at it, but that's what they're looking for. Solomon says, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. The house of feasting is a place full of mirth. Now you have different houses of feasting. Some the Christian is not allowed to go and shouldn't want to go, but others that are filled with other Christians. But you can't really, you lack an ability to contribute all that much to the house of feasting, other than maybe a plate, or even receive all that much other than food, which is great, okay, it's fine. But the house of mourning, when you can truly speak into someone's life, and maybe someone can speak into yours when you yourself are struggling, when you yourself are suffering, is far better than to go to the house of feasting. And so all I want to say is, I think we should all be searching for eternal joy, eternal happiness through our Savior, not through science, not through technology. These will only fail us. They're good insofar as they go. I'm not saying, I'm not about to convert to being Amish, although I wonder how much they might have something there. That's up to you, for your own conscience, your own relationship with God. All I'm saying is, I don't believe they're evil in and of themselves, but as we continue in our technological development, as many other generations before us though, I fear what possibly might be coming. And so again, in the weeks to come, I want to consider some of this development where it's permeated even bioethics, which has devolved into things such as transhumanism and the like. And so I want to take a little bit of time as we continue through this course, again, in really illustrating the true this time and this world ramifications, where we're living now. So it's not just this abstract philosophical consideration of these philosophies. We can see them. God willing, anyway, I can help you see them. where we are and when we are, and how these are permeating, and how they must be answered. Again, the language, our communication, we must be wise about how we do this, about how we do reach the world for the cause of Christ. Blessed be his name.